Hey, my name is Colonel Craig Broyles. I am the commander for the 81st Stryker Brigade here in the Washington Army National Guard. I've been in the military for around 26 years. One of the things that's interesting to me is I am passionate about being an agent of change. In my career, I've seen kind of effect that I think is concerning for me is that we as a military just continually have the same problem where we feel compelled to follow processes rather than focus on decisive outcome or simply on winning. I'm a veteran of the global war on terror, like many on my generation. And the thing that watching how we left Afghanistan and looking at the current situation in the Middle East is always disconcerting to me because it seems like, did we really win? I feel just a little bit of a kinship to how I imagine a lot of the senior leaders who left Vietnam must have felt. I feel committed that I don't want that to happen again. And so, therefore, what I mean is a lot of the things I really focus on is decision making and why we keep making decisions that we do, specifically like the military decision making process. I've taught military decision making, I've been a part of it. And what's interesting to me is when you kind of say MDMP to U.S. Army officers, you'll kind of shudder a little bit, and there's kind of just this kind of a, oof, kind of feeling about it. And I think it's because it's just so hard to do and we make it hard. And I think one of the reasons we make it hard is because we just kind of worship the process of MDMP. And I've seen it where we've all been there, where maybe you all been there, but if you haven't been there, I can kind of create what an MDMP kind of looks like. Typically, a bunch of officers in a room and they're trying to just crank out product that's already templated and do this MDMP piece where they'll do a mission analysis briefing, and the mission analysis will be like 250 slides and nobody's really listening. And you have the leader who's pontificating. Was that really a limitation or is that a constraint? And it just goes on and on about analysis. And in the end, whether you're a training event or whatever, the mission didn't go the way you thought it was. It's just a big mess. And you look back on it, and I've never yet seen where someone said, the reason why we got our fannies kicked was because you said it was a constraint. Damn it, it was a limitation this whole time. It's never a thing, but we just kind of always are slaves to the process. And so I've thought deeply about MDMP, about why we make decisions the way we make it, and why we just feel compelled to follow and worship a process instead of focusing on winning and focusing on decisive results. So much of what I do when I'm trying to experiment with and work with innovators and when I'm trying to train my officers is yes, processes have value because it keeps you within guideposts, but the focus has to be on winning. So that's really kind of what I'm passionate about, is really being more effective in decision making. And as they say, but we rarely do, fight the enemy and not fight the plan. And it's hard because I tell you, going against this, we're going against decades of culture that really say, and this is kind of the culture that we're up against. Culture is, if a military staff will hit these marks, will do these things, I have a little checklist, and an OCT will tip, a controller trainer will be watching you. If you do these things, did you issue a warning order? Check. Did you identify the essential task? Check. Did you identify specified tasks? Check. Did you identify implied tasks? Check. On and on and on. If you will do all these things, you will win. And that's not warfare. It's not warfare at all. You can do all those things and it still won't turn out. So therefore, how do we as a formation get to where we can plan effectively, fight the enemy and not the plan, and have decisive results versus just worship the MDMP process? So kind of where I'm at now is the first thing that I believe is, number one, I think it's interesting when you think about decide, to set the conditions, think of deciding. There's a lot of anxiety that goes with decisions. A lot of people get wrapped up on this, and I've thought about why that is. So if you look at the word decide, it's interesting because decide kind of has the root word in to strike down, or meaning to kill. When you think about homicide, well, it means to kill a man. When you think about regicide, kill a king. You think about genocide, to kill a race. Interesting, the word decide has that word, decide. And I think because When you're deciding, you're killing off options, you're killing off possibilities. So it creates this core root of anxiety that kind of goes with it. So I think that's interesting. So therefore, people just want to agonize and go over, paralysis by analysis before they make a decision. And the second thing is that I'm an absolute believer in what John Boyd did. I think he's probably the most brilliant military theorist there is. One, he's an American, so I'm a big fan of that. But he thought deeply about this same thing, is why people win and lose in combat. And what he came up with is it wasn't so much about the decision that's made, it was about the speed in which it was made and understanding the context. So John Boyd's, I'm oversimplifying, but having read a lot of his stuff, I've kind of distilled it into this core idea that yes, everyone hears about this OODA loop that John Boyd proposed, how you win and lose in combat: observe, orient, decide, and act. But I think what's missing is really, you observe a phenomenon, you observe an action, but really what makes him different is the orient, which I interpret as understand the situation. Every situation is different. Understanding the context separates good decision making versus poor decision making. And I feel like what we don't do enough, or what we do well, is understanding the context. What I mean by that is every fight takes on a life of its own. Though, situations rhyme, they're never the same. And then not only that, contexts continually change. And so what happens most of the time, I think humans are, and I'm as guilty as anybody, we become addicted to the narcotic of nostalgia. What I mean by that is, we all look back with fondness when things went right and things went well. So therefore it worked in the past. Well, I want to resurrect it. I want to do it again and do it the same way. And so therefore, we always look back with fondness of how things went well. And so we try to rerun it. And then, like most of us, when you look back, you kind of forget about the hard times. You kind of forget about how it don't work, but you just remember kind of this nostalgic kind of thing that really never existed. And so we're all addicted. Well, not all, but me. I'm definitely addicted to the narcotic of nostalgia. I think that's a human trait. And I think you can exploit that if you understand that every fight takes on a life of its own. So therefore, he or she who has a marked advantage begins with if someone is aware and not only very focused on understanding the context of every situation, and then understanding the context will continue to evolve and adapt. As long as you are aware and you are understanding the context faster than your opponent, you have a marked advantage. And the decisions that you make will be much more relevant than that of your opponent. So let me give you an example. Decision making, I think the most brilliant U.S. Army decision making model, I don't think we give it enough praise, is what I call METT-TC decision making. So for those of you who don't know, METT-TC is an acronym it represents mission variables, things that will continue to change, evolve during the course of a mission. And it stands for mission, enemy, time available, troops and support, and then terrain. And usually break down terrain in different kind of aspects, which is, observation, key terrain, avenues of approach, obstacles, and cover and concealment. The Army's added a C to it, meaning civilians, that the variables of civilians have changed. Personally, I've kind of modified it when I talk to my officers. I've added an S for security because I think in large-scale combat operations, the factors of security take primacy over civilians. So METT-TS is what I refer to it. But what's interesting is if you will constantly assess the factors of METT-TS, I believe you think of it like a meter. You have like the enemy over here and the friendly over here, and this meter, I call it the METT-TS meter. If you think about during the course of a battle or a fight, those factors are always changing and evolving. And if those factors are in your favor, you're winning the battle. If they swing over to the enemy, then the enemy's winning the battle. And I've done this where I've examined several battles like the MDMP, Tannenberg, on and on and on, just through that lens. And you can watch it and you can see how these mission variables of METT-TS continue to keep changing. Who is able to kind of grasp and put those factors in their favor, gain a marked advantage. So for example, maybe I'm given a mission, a simple mission of take a platoon and move up to a hilltop and overwatch a bridge, set up a support by fire position on top of a hilltop overwatching a bridge in order for the other two platoons to seize the bridge to allow a follow-on element to get across and continue the attack. So that's what I understand. Well, so my mission as I start moving up there is to, set a support by fire position over on top of this hill. Well, as I start moving up to this hill, let's say all of a sudden I discover that there's nobody on the bridge. I get up to overwatch it, and the enemy is, for whatever reasons, made a mistake, and there's no one on the bridge at all. And so there's this moment, well, as my mission has changed, do I continue just stay there, or understand that tasks change throughout the mission? Or perhaps I get up on the support by fire position, and instead the commander says, oh, now you're the assaulting element, which this has actually happened to me once. I thought I was a support by fire position. I turned into an assault. Now your mission changed. Your tactics will then have to change. How you do a support by fire position, very different of how you would assault a bridge. So as a mission will move along, your different missions will change, and the tactics you employ during the course of that mission, or your assessment of the mission, will dictate what tactics to employ. If you don't continue to make that assessment, then your tactics are inappropriate and you start losing. Same thing with the enemy, E. These are variables that change. Your assessment, the enemy will change throughout the course of a mission. You stumble on a platoon and it turns into, 50 or more who you thought were enemy, that they behave differently given their situation. Enemy that feels like they're being reinforced soon will behave differently. An enemy that is running out of ammunition or hasn't been reinforced long will change differently. So your assessment how the enemy is will again dictate what kind of tactics to employ, if you should engage, and how. The next one's time available. Well, time is always probably the most scarce resource that we have. You can, get more troops, you can get more soldiers, but you just can't get more time. If your assessment of how much time you have can dictate what kind of tactics, what kind of decisions you need to make. If I've been given 24 hours to set in an ambush, I can set a pretty good ambush in 24 hours. I can move quietly. We really set the conditions to win. The tactics I employ, if I have in 24 hours set that ambush, are a certain way. But instead, all of a sudden, my higher headquarters calls and says, hey, you have 1 hour to get that ambush in. Well, what kind of decisions do I need to make then? And that changes it. So the tactics you employ, given your assessment of time, again, that's a variable that you have to look at and will dictate what kind of tactics to employ. Troops in support. So your assessment of what combat multipliers you have to bring, to include if you have drones, if you have indirect fire support, how much food and water do you have, what reinforcement you have, that'll dictate what tactics you employ. If you don't have much, well, that also is going to tell you what tactics you have to employ, what techniques you have to employ. And your assessment of what troops and support you have to offer will help you understand what decisions you need to make. And again, it always evolves. So at the first, you might have a lot of ammunition. As the mission continues to evolve and you're really shooting, you start running out of ammunition, you realize you might have to change and make some different decisions. A leader who's not apprised of that, is not thinking that way, again, they start making inappropriate decisions. And then you have terrain. Now, most people, what I think they do is, and if you've been in a lot of these MDMP sessions, you'll start seeing it. They'll break down the different components. They'll say, okay, well, there's observation. Okay, and they'll talk about, observation. If you get on this hill, then you see more. Okay, great. Good job, Einstein. Or they'll say, okay, then there's cover and concealment. Down in the low ground, there'll be bushes and on and on and on. Okay, great. Good job. These roads, these are avenues of approach. Okay, great. That's not helpful. That's just harassing. But I understand it's not to look at each component of terrain, observation, avenues of approach, key terrain, cover and concealment, obstacles. It's putting it all together in a meaningful way. So how I typically look at it is, first I look at roads. People take roads. They just do. And I know now we're getting really into drone warfare, and that three-dimensional thing is really taken off, and I'm trying to change my mindset. But still, people take roads. If you think how you drove here or how you got to work today, unless you're live pretty close, you took a road. People will usually take interstate hardball roads versus dirt roads. And so you first find the roads, because that's how people travel to fights. And then if they're blocked, then they'll start taking dirt roads and then trails. Rarely did anybody just go cross country for 20, 30 miles. So find roads. Well, roads are long. They're super long. How do you control a road? Well, you can't control all of it, but they're points. They're places where everything funnels and constricted to one point. Those are called obstacles. Obstacles are anything that funnels you, restricts you, or canalizes your freedom of movement. So bridges are always one, right? Let's use bridges for an example. So bridge here in Western Washington, boy, bridges are the thing. There's so many rivers. Boy, you take a bridge out or bridge breaks down, man, you ought to see what it does. Everything comes to a grinding halt. So bridges are always are an obstacle. So then you find the obstacle. All right, so now once you found the obstacle, now you know where most likely fights are going to happen. I mean, thousands of lives have been died over trying to get bridges. So bridges are going to be super important. But now the bridge isn't the key terrain. What the key terrain is going to be, it's where you can control the bridge from, where you can observe it from. You're a hilltop or something like that, or a building where you can best control with fires, indirect fires, that bridge. Then I look at, okay, well, now I know that's where the enemy will most likely be, or I need to be. Then I think, okay, where's cover and concealment on that observation point? So I think, okay, well, this will stop me gunfire. This will protect. And that, I guarantee, that's where the enemy's going to be. So right then, that's where I mark it and say that's key terrain. So it's the synthesis of ACOCA, or that acronym, that's most important. And as I look at that, that helps me understand what tactics and techniques I should employ. And those variables will change. What I mean by that is this particular building or area might be super important, key terrain for a moment. Because if the fight moves, then that's just a building, that's just a bridge, becomes irrelevant. So not only it's the current context of how the fight is continued to change, and your assessment of mission variables will tell you what tactics and techniques to employ. And so I keep METT-TS in my headquarters. I train all my staff. Hey, we're constantly going to assess the factors of METT. Who's it favoring? Is it favoring us? Is it favoring the enemy? This is, I think, the most important thing. I've had it where there'll be a crisis will occur. We've been overrun. Everything's just falling apart. And you'll see it. Everyone will panic. What do we do? And what I immediately do is I pause and I start going through my mission variables. Okay? Does the mission need to change? What are we going to know about the enemy? How can we change the enemy? Maybe we can't do anything. What can we do with troops and support? Can we bring in troops? Can we bring in support? What can we do with time? Do we need to back up, buy us more time? What can we do with the terrain? How can we change the terrain? How can we change our security? You'll find you start doing this. All of a sudden, you start coming up with a whole bunch of things that you can do to change the outcome, to make the situation better. And all of a sudden it empowers your subordinates because like, oh, we could do that. Well, we can move there. We can control that choke point. We can call in for reinforcements this way, or we can gain better observation this way, or we can gain time on and on. You'll find that what at once looked like a bleak situation, all of a sudden you become quite empowered and you realize there's a lot you can do and you can really change the outcome and give very precise guidance to subordinates of what we need to do. So when I think of decision making and trying to really kind of put what John Boyd into practice, I find that the METT decision making is that way that I use in order to always understand the context. So observe something, understand the context, make a decision, and act. Then I observe it, I put it into context by using METT-TS, and then make a decision and act. My belief is if I'm able to do that, my opponent, again, you probably, am I assuming, operating under a narcotic of nostalgia. They're trying to rerun what they've done before. Perhaps I'm able to better grasp the context. I'm getting a marked advantage over my opponent. Now, the hard part is getting everyone to think that way, because that's, though we say METT-TC in the Army and people throw it out kind of, we overuse it and it becomes an excuse for someone doing something dumb. That's trying to get everyone to do that. That's the hard part. So METT-TS decision making is one technique. The other technique that I use, and I think it really makes me different than most anybody else, is when you start MDMP, the first thing you're supposed to start with is what they call intelligence preparation of the battlefield. And of course, we can't have, we lose clarity in the U.S. military, so we got to change things to make it more abstract. So now we call it intelligence preparation of the operating environment. But I'm a big fan of clarity. So one of my favorite quotes from General Perkins is never sacrifice clarity for accuracy. But anyway, either way, you're supposed to prepare the battlefield or the operating environment with intelligence. It usually starts with you understand kind of where you're at and the areas of influence and observation, on and on and on. That's fine. But where I think we go off And what makes me different, and again, training not to the process, but to the outcome, is we begin trying to analyze the enemy. So you evaluate the enemy, and then you start trying to come up with the enemy's courses of action, and then understand how they'll do things in sequence and in time. We call them event temps, and so on and so forth. But that aside, what typically happens is you'll see Army intelligence professionals, they'll take what hire gives them and they'll try to come up with what they think the enemy will do. And they usually define it in a binary way: most likely, most dangerous. But what I really do is, before I get there, and typically what the rest of the staff does is they kind of, okay, this is what this S2 is going to say, and then we start analyzing our mission from our point of view. And I think that's a flawed approach. So what I do differently is, what typically happens is the intelligence officer or his shop will present the enemy's most likely, most dangerous course of action. Which is kind of flawed when you think about it. Hey, the enemy's either going to do this, which we think they're going to most likely do, and then the worst thing they could do is this. And then while they're presenting that, if everyone listens, which rarely they do, the rest of the staff will immediately be jumping into analyzing the mission from their own perspective, for their own warfighting function. So, but what we do, and what I coach folks to do, and I find the right way, is the minute I get the mission, my mission, I take it how I'm seeing it, and I immediately take it and I put my hat on different, and I try to think of it as if I was actually my opponent. And I take it serious. I actually try to put myself in his or her shoes. And I try to think like, what if I was the enemy's commander? And then I get all my staff and we do the same thing. I get my S3 to look at the situation as if they were the enemy's S3. I get my chief of staff, my XO, and say, okay, you're running the enemy staff. What would you have their priorities of work do? I take my enemy's S2 and I try to sit there. Now you start trying to build an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance matrix on what you need to know. My artillery officer, hey, you're now the enemy's artillery officer. And we start building of the enemy's plan as if we were them. And I think the one thing that I think is the most important, especially because I try to think like the enemy commander, is I'll even write it up in big words. When have I won? As the enemy, when is it that I have won? And I will write, I have won when? And I define it. My decisive point. When I define decisive point is that moment I kill off all their options. I go all in. My decisive point is here. And I try to think just like I would if I was the enemy commander and I see the situation. I turn the terrain around. I try to get and look at it from line of sight from the enemy. I talk about, hey, for my fires, where do we need to put in fires to win? Where engineer? And we build this course of action. And my belief is, heard people counter that and say, well, you never really know when the enemy's, what the enemy's going to do. They can do all kinds of things. Yeah, true. But I assert that professionals think a lot alike. Military professionals, they think alike. Good ground is good ground to a military professional. If I took myself and a German officer and a British officer and maybe a Japanese, and we walked around, we'd all kind of say, man, that bridge is pretty important, isn't it? Or we would take a look and say, man, we got to be on reverse slopes, or on and on and on. Like we think alike. And you think about like a brain surgeon. You can't tell me a brain surgeon in California thinks a whole lot different than a brain surgeon in Italy. Pros think alike. And so when you think that premise, then you'll know that, as though I might not be able to predict all what the enemy will do, I think I'm pretty close. And then I build the enemy course of action if I was actually doing it. I tell you, I can come up with a pretty good plan. And once I've built the enemy course of action, I know what I need to win, and I do it as if I know who I'm up against. Once I build that enemy plan as if I was really trying to win, then I flip it around and I look at it from the blue perspective. And here's my test. My test always is, if I look at that enemy plan after I've flipped it around, and if I don't rub my head, and I think, how in the hell am I ever going to beat this? I know I've done it wrong. Because think about it. When you go in real warfare, you're going up against the enemy's varsity team. It's the best they've got. They don't launch their operation until they know they've won. I guarantee they have did everything they can to set the conditions to win. They've won. And unless you look at that enemy course of action, and unless you are baffled on how you're going to win it, you probably did it wrong and you need to go back and start over. But few people do that. One, because they just don't have time. Two, hubris, all the reasons, I think. So what I do is I first look at the enemy and I force my folks to fight it as if we were them. Thing one. Then what I do is then I flip it around, I look at it, and I make sure that I'm like, man, this is going to be tough. And I found that not only that, I'll go to my boss and I have pretty good questions of what it's going to take for me to win. Then when I go to build my course of action, I build it to beat that plan that I thought me and my staff thought was the way the enemy's going to do it. And so therefore now I've found that I'm usually not that, if I were off, we're probably not that far off. And then we war game it and then put it into action. And then really what we do with our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is we're just looking to see, we're arranging our named area of interest, our reconnaissance platform to see, if we're off on what we think the enemy is going to do, because that's how we would do it. So that's thing two. So METT-TS decision making, I call that red lens thinking, trying to think like the enemy and actually trying to put it into action. And then the third decision making model that I think makes us focus on outcomes rather than worshiping the process is what I call commander's intent. Now, you hear a lot about it. It's in our operations orders. However, we just kind of give it marginal attention. So what the purpose of commander's intent is, going back to what John Boyd talked about. Commander's intent, you're supposed to look at it 2 levels above. So commander's intent is this method that you understand that the situation is going to change. You understand that the conditions are going to evolve as things go on. So therefore, the commander cannot foresee every possible circumstance or how the situation is going to change. What they can be sure of is provide clear intent. This is, in the end, we need to have Hill 1, 2, 3 in our control. How it happens, it's kind of up to you, but we have to have it, because if we have Hill 1, 2, 3, then that will allow us a jumping off point for our division's main effort or whatever. What typically happens, though, is commanders will above echelon just kind of, they'll just write it and they'll kind of nest it and all that. And they briefed, it's just kind of, okay, one more thing, instead of making it the thing. And I'll kind of use just kind of my wrestling analogies. This is how commander's intent is kind of supposed to work. The whole premise is acknowledging that the person at the point of action, the person closest to the point of action, is best situated to make the decision that is most appropriate given the context. For example, think of a wrestler. So 2 wrestlers are on the mat. There'll be a moment when that wrestler, the intent is to win. There'll be a moment when that wrestler is tied up with his opponent, he moves a certain way, and he sees a slight opportunity where he has a possibility to take a shot and take his opponent down. The person to best make that decision is that wrestler in that moment. However, if that wrestler has to pause, turn around, and say, Coach, hey, I see his left leg open here, and I'm kind of turning to the left. I think now's a good time for me to take this shot. And that coach then sits back and goes, yeah, I think you're right. I think this is a good time. Go ahead and do that. Okay, we all, I think, can see the consequences of that. The situation's changed by then, and it's so different. So the person's best situation is that person's point of action. However, commanders the risk of that is when somebody, though, is in the fight, though, what happens is they get tunnel vision. They lose perspective. They don't understand the bigger picture. So sometimes, though they think in the moment they're making the right decision, but what they're actually doing to the overall scheme is harming it. Kind of heard like during the GWAT, they talked about the strategic corporal who in the moment thought they were doing something right in that very narrow situation, but overall it had strategically negative consequences. So therefore, because of that, most commanders become very risk adverse, and they do not let their subordinates make decisions close to the point of action because they believe they don't understand the context. And so therefore they'll make decisions that will harm the overall objective. So therefore they put them on a leash. Hey, don't make that decision. And so there's this time problem where though there's a moment that there was an opportunity to do something that was squandered because you had to relay it. So there's always this tension between who should make the best decision. We all know the person at the point of action has the most appropriate information, can seize opportunities, but because of their tunnel vision or because of their narrow understanding of the situation, might do something wrong and cause overall harm to the entire thing. So the solution is what they call commander's intent. So commander's intent is 2 levels up. So me as a brigade commander, I would need to think like the corps commander. So the division of the corps, and understand what the corps is trying to do. My battalion commanders need to think like the division commander. The company commander needs to understand the brigade commander's intent. If that provides them the proper scale and the width and the breadth to understand the context of the situation. And then I said, hey, in the end, this is what I'm intending to do. Do you understand how this is supposed to work and why we're doing it a certain way? If our subordinates truly understand that, now armed with the proper context, now they can take actions and they would say, you know what? I don't have to really necessarily need to ask Broyles if this is the right thing to do. I see how Broyles is thinking. So even he's not here, this is the action he'd want me to take anyway. And so now therein is the solution of that time problem. So that soldier, that officer, that leader at the point of action understands what the overall intent would be and can make decisions at the point of action, take advantage of opportunities that present themselves. So that's focusing on outcome rather than just following the process. So really decision making, I've become kind of an apostle of this method is METT-TC decision making, most brilliant Army construct they've come up with. Big fan. 2 is red lens thinking. As you start first, look at the situation and try to put yourself in as the enemy and come up with how the enemy would fight it. I arrange it just like I would. I take a long time to do it. And I find that as I do that, I might be slow in, but it allows me to be fast out because then I truly understand how I think the enemy's going to fight this thing. Pros think alike. And then last is commander's intent. Understand 2 levels up what the commander's intending to do, and that allows you then to operate. You understand the context, and now you can make decisions at the point of action as every fight takes on a life of its own. If you understand the commander's intent, it liberates individual energies to achieve victory. So those are my decision-making models and how we can, as an Army, be an agent of change and focus on winning rather than continue to worship the process.